Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And the reason I'm doing that buffering voice is because I'm scrolling around on my phone here looking at a couple of really good questions that came up on the subreddit as we've been talking about Matthew chapter 17. And I've decided that instead of charging ahead into this material we have coming up starting in verse 24 of chapter 17 about some kind of church tax and some kind of controversy that came with that, we are instead going to tackle these pair of questions that have come up regarding what we've been looking at previously in Matthew chapter 17, most notably the Transfiguration. So question number one comes from somebody who goes by the internet handle WSBTC, and the question is, why only 3 apostles at the Transfiguration, and why those 3? And as I thumb through your responses here, I gotta say, pretty nice work, community. You all know what you're doing. Like, I should just mail you all microphones and have you do this because you're smart. First of all, it's a great question. Why only 3 apostles at the Transfiguration, and why those 3? And here are some very thoughtful answers. Phantom316 has the top post in response, and he or she writes, Peter, James, and John were the inner circle of the somewhat inner circle. Jesus had a ton of followers, but chose 12 to be apostles and 3 to be there, especially for significant events like the Transfiguration, Garden of Gethsemane. If I had to guess on the reason, Phantom316 writes, they were his closest friends, and he wanted to share that with them, or he had a special job for them in the founding of the church, but that's purely speculation. It's pretty dang good speculation, in my humble opinion. I think the most obvious reason that those 3 got to come up to the Transfiguration is it does seem like Jesus liked them best. Is that bad? I don't know. It just seems honest. All the Gospels give the impression that these 3 guys really stand out among the 12. We do not get a bunch of specific anecdotes about Jesus having meaningful exchanges with Bartholomew or Simon the Zealot. I'm sure those guys were very important and did lots of neat things. James, son of Alphaeus, he doesn't come up much more than being mentioned in lists. It's not that Jesus didn't like them. I mean, they made it into the final cut of the people who got to be the closest with him. But there's something pretty unique about Peter, James, and John. Now, James and John, you remember, brothers. They're the sons of thunder. That was their nickname. And then Peter, of course, is the brash, headstrong, charge into things, leader of the group, say whatever is on his mind. If you've ever mentored something, or you've ever been a counselor at camp or worked with any group, there's always a kid or two who pops. They're the kids who maybe they're a little rough around the edges, but man, there's a diamond in that rough. And you know that it might take some extra effort or energy or attention, but there's just this load of potential in this kid or that group of kids. And I think that's how Jesus feels about these guys. Peter is obviously the front runner amongst the apostles in terms of what we get in the Gospels for stupid stuff, for brash stuff, for doing things that are bold but maybe a little bit misguided. Peter always comes off like he would be the best candidate for this sharp instrument that if you just pointed it in the right direction, it would cut in all the right ways and amazing things would happen. But who's the runner-up to that? Like, who's next in terms of examples that we get of the disciples doing big, brash, silly things and falling on their faces a little bit? Well, it's these 2 brothers. It's James and John. And most of their bumbling happens in tandem, the Tweedledee, Tweedledum routine. They're the ones who want to burn a village because the people in the village don't like Jesus enough right away. They're the ones who are like, hey, when you are dead, can we be in charge of your kingdom and have your sweater? That's their routine. They're thinking about it wrong. And just like every state in the union is very grateful for that one that lags way, 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 way behind in all of the metrics. And they can always be like, haha, well, we might not be very good, but there's that state. So I think James and John are like, thank goodness there's Peter. How awful would we have ended up looking in the Bible if there hadn't been Peter to look even dumber? I don't think it's a coincidence that the 3 most bumbling of the disciples are the inner circle of disciples as well. There's this fine line between bumbling and the boldness that it takes to bumble and profound accomplishment. And all of these guys, to speak further to Phantom316's response, did end up having profound accomplishments. James, his opportunities get cut a little bit short, I suppose, because in Acts 12, one of the most graphic and easy to picture and fascinating of all the chapters in the whole Bible, Acts chapter 12 has Herod Agrippa executing James. So James is out of the game a little bit prematurely, but still looks like he was a significant early leader of the church. The resources that he and his brother John had access to probably helped get the church and the disciples on their feet. John, obviously, he went on to accomplish a ton of stuff. He wrote 5 books of the Bible. I mean, he cheated on one of them because Jesus wrote a huge percentage of it himself, and it's all in red. But still, you got to give credit where credit's due. 5 books of the Bible. That's pretty stinking good. And it's interesting, too, that these 2 brothers, James and John, end up on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of who dies when, because James dies first. Well, I mean, Judas Iscariot, but that's kind of the outlier, right? James dies first as a martyr, and John is never martyred. It looks like he lives out his whole life and dies of old age. So you got these 2 brothers who had great influence between them, and especially John. And then you got Peter, who, I mean, come on, we've discussed it a ton, who also has obviously massive influence, so massive that different groups even fight over who gets the biggest claim on Peter because he is so very, very significant. So I don't think there's anything off about what Phantom 316 is saying there. The thing that I wanted to add to that, I see that somebody else is hitting up right here. Yeah. Coffee Swirler says 2 or 3 witnesses is a standard of evidence in the Bible. That's where I was going to go. I mean, you got to have a few people up there. You want them to be credible people. And so this inner circle would satisfy the legal obligation to be like, I mean, you want us to believe that somebody got lit up like the sun and then Moses and Elijah showed up? That's far-fetched, but you got 2 witnesses right there. It becomes less far-fetched, and it satisfies the demands of evidence that culture would have held out. Other people on here are talking about how 3 is this number of symmetry and unity, and there's definitely truth to that, though I think it's maybe a little bit hard to specifically nail down here how 3 relates exactly to this passage, or exactly how that number is some sort of specific completion here. It's just, I mean, I don't know, you'd expect it to be 3, given the way these things kind of work out all throughout the Bible. So all of that stuff we're just kicking around is an answer to the question, why only 3 apostles at the Transfiguration, and why those 3? I guess we spent most of our time just now talking about why those 3, but why only 3? I don't know. This was intimate. It was personal. It was special. Maybe there is some really unique commissioning that is happening for these guys. Whatever the case, I thought it was a great question, and I still want there to be time for one more question, which comes from McErman family, MCERMAN family. This simply writes, how do they know it was Moses and Elijah at the Transfiguration? During the Transfiguration, how did they know who the other 2 guys were that appeared and were speaking with Jesus? And I haven't read through all of these comments here, but I have to imagine that this event took a lot longer to unfold than it does for us to read the couple of sentences that address it. As this is unfolding, I assume Moses was talking about Moses stuff and Elijah was talking about Elijah stuff. I also don't think it's crazy to imagine that somewhere in there Jesus was like, hey, look, it's Moses and Elijah right there. See them? And they start talking. And then as Jesus is off talking with them, Peter, James, and John, maybe if Jesus says that in a completely normal environment, they're like, I don't think that's probably Moses and Elijah because of how they're dead and we're just on a hike. But when Jesus is glowing like the sun and the world is all transformed around them and everything feels different, it becomes a lot more possible to believe that, oh yeah, that's actually Moses and Elijah. In a way, I'm kind of glad that passages like this don't give us the tedium of how they knew, but that is not to say, McErman family, that it's not a great question. I love that there's room for these questions because I wonder about this stuff too. I just like how quickly the Bible hums along, and I like the way the details it gives us pretty much tells us, hey, look here, focus on this thing. This is the point that really matters. Whereas if you cluttered it up with a whole bunch of other details like that, and there's really no theological significance to it, and it doesn't really advance the point of the story, it would create confusion. This thing is beautifully streamlined. I think the Gospels are tuned just the right way to have the perfect mix of moving us through the story and giving us enough details to get it, but also staying theologically focused so that we know what to look at. And as I'm talking, I see that Petrified Gumball suggested that the disciples grew up in Sunday school and recognized Moses and Elijah from a flannel graph. Well played. Well played. At any rate, thanks to everybody who unwittingly participated in the conversation today by jumping over into the conversation on the subreddit, which you don't have to do this at all to be a part of the podcast, but it seems like it's fun for the handful of people who go and participate. If you go to reddit.com, which can be a very dark place, by the way, I mean, tread lightly. There's beautiful things there. There's pretty weird things there. It's the Wild West over there on Reddit. So if it's overwhelming over there at Reddit at first, I completely get it. The way the site works is Reddit is just a generic place where every kind of conversation about any imaginable thing can happen. And well, if you are hanging out on subreddits or discussions that are good things will happen. If you're hanging out in places that are weird things will happen. You get what you want. So in this case, r/ or the subreddit TMBH podcast is where some people discuss this. I don't promote that a ton or anything, but you're welcome to jump in over there. And from time to time, I do as well. Thanks for gaming this stuff out with me. We are headed toward the last bit of Matthew 17 and this weird church tax anecdote that we're going to look at next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10 Minute Bible Hour podcast. I appreciate you. Let's do this again soon.
All your questions, okay, maybe not all your questions. That answers some of your questions on the 10